Chapter 1. A Desperate Request. The Galleon starship had been traveling for weeks through the darker fringes of space, its engines humming softly in the empty void, the miles of stars stretching out endlessly around it. It was on one of these long, tiresome journeys that Dr. Gavin Holt found himself grappling with a sense of deep emptiness, his once thriving career as a scientist now nothing more than a long-forgotten memory. His time spent in the quiet, sterile cabin of his ship had become a routine wake-up, check instruments, make calculations, perform experiments, but it was all mechanical. It had become the life of a man who had nothing to look forward to, someone whose soul had been weighed down by the monotony of his existence. It had been years since he left Earth, and even though he had traveled across many worlds, studied different species, and interacted with various cultures, he had never felt more alone. The stars were beautiful, the planets fascinating, but none of it could fill the void that had grown inside him. There was no warmth in the coldness of space, and nothing he did could erase the deep ache in his chest. What was once a dream had turned into a never-ending cycle of solitude and emptiness. Dr. Holt wasn't a bad man. He had just become weary. He had chosen to become a part of the intergalactic research program years ago to explore the unknown, to discover new life, and to expand humanity's reach beyond the limitations of Earth. But now, as he stared out into the infinite blackness, all he could see was his own reflection in the window, alone, surrounded by the beauty of the cosmos but unable to touch it. He was a man running from something he couldn't name, a man who had abandoned his roots to dive into the unknown. Yet, in the end, he had found only a hollow version of life, one filled with experiments and data, but lacking the connections that made the human experience so rich. It was in this state of deep reflection that a sudden blaring alarm broke the silence of the ship, snapping him out of his reverie. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the console, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to process the data coming through the sensors. A distress signal. It wasn't uncommon to pick up such signals out here in the far reaches of space. There were plenty of rogue ships, pirates, and outposts that went dark, but this one was different. The transmission was not only urgent, but also strangely human. The voice was calm, yet tinged with desperation. It was fragmented, distorted by interference, but the message was clear enough. Someone was in trouble. Dr. Holt's mind immediately went to work, running through calculations to pinpoint the source of the distress signal. He tapped the console rapidly, fingers moving with practiced speed. The signal was weak, distorted by space debris and the interference of the surrounding magnetic fields. Still, it was undeniable, a plea for help from someone stranded in deep space. Whoever they weren't going to survive long in these conditions. They needed immediate assistance. His heart pounded as he stared at the coordinates flashing on the screen. A nearby planet. It wasn't on any major galactic maps, not a place anyone would typically visit. But the coordinates pointed to a small, forgotten corner of the galaxy, a place that had been neglected, where little was known and little happened. It didn't take much to guess why. It was a remote place, uninhabited and dangerous to navigate. Dr. Holt hesitated for a moment. The decision to help was not an easy one. He was no hero. In fact, he had spent most of his life trying to avoid conflict, preferring the solitude of his research and the safety of his ship to the chaos of human interaction. But something about the distress signal, something about the faint voice that crackled through his comms, pulled at him. It was a risk, but it was a chance for connection, a chance to break free from his self-imposed isolation. He'd spent so long running from the world, from the people he once knew, from the life he left behind. Perhaps this was the universe's way of offering him a way out. He punched in the coordinates, setting the course for the planet. The ship hummed as it adjusted its course, its engines firing up with a small jolt of movement. As Dr. Holt sat back in the captain's chair, his hands gripping the armrests, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to change everything. Little did he know how much this simple decision would alter his life in ways he could never have imagined. Hours passed as the Galleon starship made its way toward the planet. Dr. Holt stared at the screen, tracking the path as the tiny planet grew larger with each passing moment. His mind raced with questions. Who had sent the distress signal? What had happened to them? He knew it was probably another stranded traveler or a ship in need of repairs, but there was an odd tension in the air. The message had been too urgent, too desperate for him to dismiss. The planet loomed closer, its surface covered in thick, swirling clouds. The atmosphere was toxic, another reason it had remained so uninhabited. It was a place that only the brave or foolish would venture. And yet, here he was, navigating his ship toward it without a second thought, driven by something he hadn't felt in years, the desire to help. The ship entered the atmosphere, shaking slightly as it descended through the thick, choking clouds. The view outside was a swirl of gray and yellow as the air grew thicker, the temperature rising. He could feel the heat building up in the cockpit, the metal of the ship growing uncomfortably warm. It was clear this planet wasn't welcoming, but he was close now, and he couldn't turn back. Dr. Holt activated the comm system, hoping to establish a connection with whoever had sent the distress signal. A crackle of static filled the room, and then a voice broke through the noise, soft, strained, and filled with desperation. "Please, I need help." The voice was faint, distant, but it was unmistakable, an alien voice, pleading for assistance. It sounded female, fragile, almost childlike in its tone. But there was an urgency there, a fear that prickled the back of Dr. Holt's neck. He adjusted the controls, focusing on the source of the transmission. I'm stranded here, please." The voice continued, its words fading into the static again. Dr. Holt's heart pounded in his chest. Who was this alien? Why was she here? And more importantly, what did she want? The questions multiplied, but the sense of obligation gnawed at him. He had no choice. He had to find her, had to help her, even if he had no idea what he was walking into. The ship touched down on the planet's surface with a soft thud, the metal struts of the landing gear absorbing the shock. He unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his gear, making his way to the hatch. His heart raced in anticipation, but he had no idea what he would find when he opened that door. The planet was silent, almost oppressively so, and as he stepped out into the airlock, the oppressive heat hit him like a wall. He glanced around, scanning the barren landscape outside the ship, but there was nothing, not a single sign of life in sight. Then, through the haze of dust and steam, he saw her. A figure, barely visible against the smog, standing near the edge of the ship. She was tall, with striking, shimmering blue skin, long silver hair cascading down her back. Her eyes were bright, nearly glowing, and they locked onto him immediately. She was stunning, beautiful, in a way that was almost otherworldly. But her beauty was overshadowed by the fear in her expression. She was trembling, her arms wrapped tightly around her body as if trying to protect herself from some invisible threat. Dr. Holt stepped forward, his voice steady as he approached her. "You're the one who sent the distress signal." She nodded, her voice barely audible. "Please, help me. I have nothing left. No one else came. I beg you." Her words trailed off, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at him with eyes full of fear and sorrow. "What happened?" Dr. Holt asked, his concern deepening as he saw the despair in her eyes. I have no home. No people," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm lost. I was abandoned here. Please, I need help. I'll do anything. I'll serve you, if that's what you want. I just need a place to stay. Somewhere safe. I have no one. I have nothing." Dr. Holt stared at her in disbelief. An alien, stranded on a hostile planet, begging a human for help? Begging him to take her in? It was incomprehensible, but there was something in her eyes, something desperate and genuine, that pierced through his disbelief. The words she spoke seemed to carry an immense weight. This wasn't just about survival. This was about something far deeper. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" he asked. "What do you want from me?" Her voice faltered as she spoke again. "I will be your servant. I have nothing. I am nothing. Please, just take me with you." The desperation in her words echoed in the silence between them, and Dr. Holt felt his heart twist. The truth was, he had never expected anything like this, an alien begging for refuge. But there was a sincerity in her plea that he couldn't ignore. He hesitated for a long moment, unsure of what to say. And then, the words came. "All right," he said softly. "I'll take you with me. But you have to understand, I don't know what I can offer you. I can't make promises." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you. Thank you so much. You don't know what this means to me." And in that moment, Dr. Holt understood. This was no longer just about him. It was about offering her a chance, a future, a place to belong in a universe that had cast her aside. A chance to begin again. And so, they left that barren planet together, two souls bound by desperation and the hope of a new beginning. Dr. Holt helped the alien woman into the ship, watching her closely as she stepped through the airlock. She moved slowly, cautiously, as if the simple act of walking into the Galleon starship might cause her to shatter. Her face was pale, though her striking eyes shimmered with a quiet intensity that betrayed her true strength, hidden beneath layers of vulnerability. As she settled into one of the seats, Dr. Holt glanced at her again, noticing the fine tremor in her limbs, the way she gripped the armrest as if it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The air in the cockpit felt heavier with each passing moment, filled with the weight of unspoken questions. This alien, this beautiful and desperate woman, had just placed her fate in his hands, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. "What's your name?" Dr. Holt asked, his voice softer now, the hardness of the previous moments melting away into something closer to curiosity. The woman looked up, meeting his eyes with a gaze that was almost too intense for comfort, but at the same time, there was something gentle about it. She hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. Her lips parted, then closed again, her mind perhaps trying to make sense of her new situation, unsure of how much she could trust this human who had taken her in. Finally, she spoke. "Lyra," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lyra of the Ryderians." Dr. Holt nodded slowly, processing the information. He had heard of the Ryderians, an ancient race, known for their beauty, their intelligence, and their connection to the vast energies that filled the universe. They were said to be rare, almost mythic, with a culture deeply rooted in exploration and understanding of the cosmos. Yet, the last time he had heard about them, they were still a thriving civilization, rich in technology and knowledge. To hear Lyra's words, to see the way she trembled in front of him, it didn't make sense. A race as advanced as hers couldn't possibly have fallen so far. And yet here she was, a beautiful, lost alien, with nowhere to turn. "Why? Why were you left behind?" Dr. Holt asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The question had been burning at the back of his mind since the moment he first saw her. What could drive someone like her to this point? Her eyes darkened at the question, and a visible sadness passed over her face. She pulled her knees to her chest, curling into herself, her silver hair cascading like a veil over her shoulders. She took a deep, shaky breath before speaking, her voice tinged with the weight of a painful past. "I was cast away," Lyra began, her words slow, each one heavy with emotion. "My people, they no longer wanted me. I was different. They said I was a burden. I had nothing to offer. They left me on a planet, abandoned with nothing but my memories." Dr. Holt's heart twisted at the rawness of her admission. Abandoned by her own people. The story was painful, but it was all too common in a galaxy full of war, betrayal, and alien cultures where empathy often took a backseat to survival. He could see the cracks in her story, the unspoken parts of it, the parts that were too painful to articulate. But Dr. Holt didn't push her for more. She had shared what she was willing to, and it was enough for now. He sat across from her, giving her the space she needed. The quiet hum of the Galleon starship filled the room again as they drifted further away from the forsaken planet. He adjusted the ship's navigation system, setting a course toward a known space station. He wasn't sure what would happen once they arrived. He wasn't even sure how long she would stay with him. But in that moment, he understood that the path ahead was uncertain for both of them. As the ship drifted deeper into space, Dr. Holt found himself staring out the viewport. The stars were quiet, as they always were. Yet for the first time in a long while, he felt a shift within himself, something he hadn't experienced in years, a connection. It was fleeting, but it was real. He had offered this stranger, this alien, a chance at survival, and in return, he felt something stirring in him, a spark of hope that had long been extinguished. The galaxy was vast, full of dangers and wonders beyond imagination, and yet, in this moment, with Lyra aboard the ship, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. Chapter 2, A New Beginning. Days passed in a strange quiet. The Galleon starship moved steadily through the endless stretches of space, its engines humming steadily, yet the atmosphere inside the ship was anything but still. Dr. Holt could feel the weight of his decisions pressing on him every day, but it was in the subtle moments that things began to shift. Lyra, the alien beauty he had so unexpectedly taken in, remained a mystery in many ways. She had been surprisingly compliant, quiet yet receptive, and Dr. Holt noticed that every time he glanced at her, she was watching him, not in a way that felt invasive, but with a sense of curiosity and awe. It made him uneasy at first, but over time, he realized that she wasn't just studying him, she was simply trying to understand the strange creature who had chosen to help her. It was strange how quickly their lives had intertwined, two strangers in the vastness of space, brought together by fate or perhaps something greater. Lyra would sit in the cockpit with him sometimes, watching the stars pass by, her wide eyes fixed on the cosmos, as if she was looking for something she had lost. Dr. Holt would attempt conversation, offering tidbits of information about the galaxies they passed, the new worlds they were heading toward, but Lyra rarely spoke unless spoken to. When she did, her words were soft and deliberate, as if carefully choosing each one before letting it escape her lips. But over time, she had begun to open up more, especially when she spoke of her people, of her lost world, and of the strange and ancient technology she carried with her. "We were once great explorers," she told him one evening as they watched a moonrise from the observation deck. "We charted the stars, found new worlds, and learned from all the species we encountered. We valued knowledge above all else, and our people were admired for our wisdom." Dr. Holt listened intently, his curiosity piqued by the richness of her history. It was fascinating, hearing about a civilization that had once thrived, only to see it crumble under the weight of its own hubris. "What happened?" he asked softly. "Why did they abandon you?" Lyra's gaze darkened, and for a moment, Dr. Holt thought she wouldn't answer. Then, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "They said I was a failure. I was born with abilities that scared them, abilities they couldn't control or understand. I could sense things that others couldn't. I could read energy, feel the currents of the universe flowing through me, and I could manipulate them in ways that were unnatural to them. They didn't understand it. They thought it was a curse, and they cast me out." Dr. Holt sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had just revealed. An alien with abilities beyond even her own people's comprehension? That was something he had never heard of before, and yet, it made sense. Her eyes, her quiet strength, the way she seemed to move with the cosmos itself. She wasn't just another alien. She was something entirely different. "They feared me," Lyra continued, her voice distant. "They thought my abilities would lead to destruction. And so, they left me on a forgotten planet. Alone. The last of my kind." Dr. Holt felt his heart go out to her. Her story was one of unimaginable pain and abandonment. And yet, there she was, still alive, still fighting to survive in a universe that had turned its back on her. He wasn't sure what the right thing to say was, so instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging her pain in the way he knew best by listening. As the days wore on, their bond deepened. It was unspoken, but it was there. Lyra began to help him with small tasks aboard the ship, though her abilities remained a mystery to him. He had yet to see her demonstrate the powers she mentioned, but something told him that she wasn't ready to reveal everything just yet. Her hesitation was palpable, but Dr. Holt didn't press her. Whatever was holding her back, he understood. It wasn't his place to ask. They continued their journey, traveling toward the nearest known space station, where Dr. Holt hoped they could restock supplies and perhaps make contact with other travelers. The days blurred together, but the tension between them eased. In the quiet moments, Dr. Holt found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. Lyra had given him something he had long since abandoned: hope. She had no one else, and yet, she trusted him. That trust, fragile and delicate as it was, meant more to him than he had realized. He had come to understand that their connection, no matter how fleeting, was something neither of them could ignore. And yet, despite the growing warmth between them, there was always the shadow of the unknown. What would happen when they reached the station? What was Lyra's future? What was his? They were two lost souls in a galaxy filled with possibilities, but no answers. And neither of them knew what would come next. As the Galleon starship sailed silently through the vast, uncharted stretches of space, Dr. Holt found himself lost in thought more often than not. The quiet hum of the ship was a stark contrast to the storm of questions swirling inside his mind. With every passing day, his connection to Lyra grew, but with that connection came an increasing sense of unease. There was so much he didn't understand about her, so much she wasn't saying. Lyra's powers, her abilities to manipulate the very fabric of the universe, and the history of her people, all seemed to be wrapped in layers of mystery that she was reluctant to reveal. Yet, every conversation with her unearthed something new, something fascinating and frightening. They had been traveling for what felt like an eternity, and yet, The atmosphere inside the ship had settled into something more comfortable, albeit tense. Dr. Holt had given Lyra space to acclimate, to gather her thoughts, while he focused on the ship's systems and plotted their course to the nearest station. He couldn't help but wonder what awaited them when they arrived. The universe had a way of throwing unexpected challenges at you, and the thought of what might lie ahead, the unknown dangers, the shadows that might follow them, kept him on edge. But he refused to dwell on those uncertainties. For now, he had to focus on the task at hand, getting to the station, restocking, and keeping Lyra safe. Lyra, for her part, had been quiet but cooperative. She stayed out of the way when necessary, yet she was always present, always watching. She had a way of observing everything, as if her mind was constantly working, processing, making sense of things Dr. Holt could only begin to comprehend. Though she had spoken little about her past, he could see glimpses of the pain that lingered in her eyes. The way she winced when she thought he wasn't looking, the hesitation in her movements, each gesture was like an open window into her soul. It was late one evening, as the stars outside the ship's observation deck glimmered faintly, that Lyra finally spoke again, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Dr. Holt was seated at the console, running diagnostics when she entered the room, her figure barely visible in the dim light. "I've been thinking," Lyra said, her voice quiet, yet resolute. Dr. Holt turned to her, his gaze softening as he pushed back from the console. "About what?" Lyra stood by the viewport, her eyes fixed on the distant stars. "About my people. About the Ryderians." She paused, a deep sigh escaping her lips. "They were never perfect, you know. They were beautiful in their way, yes, but they were flawed. My people believed too much in the pursuit of knowledge, the idea that knowledge alone could save them. But in the end, they failed. They didn't see the dangers that came with it. They were blinded by their own hubris." She glanced at him, her eyes flickering with a mix of sadness and regret. "That's why they abandoned me. Because of what I could do. Because I was a reminder of the mistake they made. They were afraid that if I ever fully understood my power, I would destroy them." Dr. Holt remained silent, letting her words wash over him. He had always been a man of science, driven by reason and logic, but he understood the dangers of unchecked ambition. He had seen what it could do, not just to civilizations but to individuals as well. Lyra's words made him think of his own failures, his own choices that had led him to this point. He had been running from something for years, just as she had. "It wasn't your fault," Dr. Holt said after a long moment, his voice gentle but firm. "Your people made their choices. They chose fear over understanding. They failed to see the potential of what you could offer. But that doesn't make you the problem." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps forgiveness. For a long time, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded, as if accepting his words. "Maybe you're right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But the damage is done. I'm alone now, and I don't know if I can ever find my place again." She turned away from him, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her words had taken their toll. "I have nothing. No people. No home." Dr. Holt felt a pang of sympathy for her. He knew what it was like to feel lost, to be cast adrift in the universe without a sense of direction. It was a feeling he had carried with him for far too long, and now, in the quiet moments with Lyra, he realized how much he had been searching for anyone who could understand that loneliness. Perhaps that was why he had responded to her distress signal. Perhaps, deep down, he had seen something in her that mirrored his own soul. "You're not alone," he said, his voice quieter now. "Not anymore." She looked at him again, her eyes searching his face for the truth in his words. "You don't know what you're offering," she said softly, almost with a hint of fear. "You don't know what it means for you to take me in. My people's technology, it's dangerous. And the syndicates, they'll come for me. They won't stop until they have what I carry." Dr. Holt's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Lyra hesitated before answering. "I didn't just come from a lost world, Dr. Holt. I carry with me the last remnants of my people's greatest achievement, their greatest failure. The technology that was meant to protect us, but instead, it became a weapon. It's something that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. But it's also something that, if used wrong, could destroy everything." Dr. Holt's pulse quickened as the gravity of her words hit him. He had always suspected there was more to Lyra's story than she was letting on, but hearing her speak of dangerous technology, something that could change the course of history, only deepened the mystery. And with that mystery came the realization that Lyra wasn't just a lost alien woman. She was someone caught in a fight much bigger than herself, and now, whether he wanted to or not, Dr. Holt was in it too. The Syndicate, Dr. Holt murmured. They're after you for this technology? Lyra nodded grimly. They know it exists. They've been tracking me since I left my home. They'll stop at nothing to get their hands on it, and once they do, it will be too late. The technology isn't just a tool. It's a power, and they will use it to dominate everything. I don't want that to happen. Dr. Holt's mind raced. This was bigger than just helping a stranded traveler. This was about stopping something far darker, something that could change the entire galaxy. He had already stepped into this war, whether he liked it or not. And now, he had to figure out what to do with that knowledge. We need to move fast, Dr. Holt said, his voice firm, his decision already made. We'll get to the station, resupply, and then we'll figure out our next steps. But we're not alone in this anymore. We're in this together. Lyra looked at him, the faintest flicker of gratitude crossing her face. She nodded slowly, as if understanding that he had just made a decision that would change both of their lives. I won't let them take you, Dr. Holt added. We'll keep running if we have to, but we're not giving up on this. For the first time since she arrived, Lyra smiled a small, almost imperceptible smile, but one that was filled with relief. It was a smile that conveyed more than words could ever express. And in that moment, Dr. Holt realized that perhaps they weren't just running from danger. Maybe, just maybe, they were running towards something else, something that would change both of their lives forever. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. The days following their conversation were tense. The weight of Lyra's revelation about the dangerous technology she carried looming heavily over both of them. The Galleon starship continued its journey, steadily moving toward the nearest known station where Dr. Holt hoped to resupply and gather information on any potential threats lurking nearby. But every passing minute felt like an eternity. Dr. Holt couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The deeper they went into space, the more he sensed a growing presence, a shadow that seemed to follow them from system to system. It was as if the galaxy itself had begun to close in on them, tightening its grip with every passing moment. Lyra was quieter than usual, her gaze often fixed on the stars outside the viewport, as though she could see something out there, something beyond the reach of Dr. Holt's understanding. He didn't ask her what she was looking for. He didn't need to. Her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was searching for something more than just survival. She was searching for a way out, a way to stop the inevitable. Dr. Holt spent most of his time tinkering with the ship's systems, trying to make the necessary repairs to ensure they wouldn't be caught in the middle of deep space without enough fuel or power. He also scoured through the data he had gathered on the syndicates that Lyra had mentioned. The more he read, the more he realized how far-reaching these organizations were. They were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, controlling vast stretches of space, manipulating governments, and pulling the strings of the galaxy's most powerful empires. The more he dug, the more he uncovered about their insidious influence. But one thing became clear: they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And right now, they wanted Lyra. As the station came into view, Dr. Holt's grip on the controls tightened. He knew this was their best chance to rest, to gather resources, and perhaps to find some allies. But he also knew it could be a trap. The Syndicate had eyes everywhere, and he couldn't risk a moment of weakness. They needed to stay ahead of them. He couldn't let them take Lyra, he couldn't let them take what she was carrying. Stay sharp, he said to Lyra as he brought the ship into the station's docking bay. We can't afford to trust anyone here. She nodded without a word, her gaze sharp, her posture rigid. Together, they stepped out into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. The Galleon starship glided silently into the station's docking bay, the weight of their arrival pressing down on both Dr. Holt and Lyra. As the ship settled into place, the familiar hum of the engines dimmed, leaving an eerie silence that filled the cockpit. Dr. Holt's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind racing with plans, contingencies, and the unspoken fear that they were walking straight into a trap. It wasn't just the station that made him wary, it was the feeling that the universe itself was slowly tightening its grip on them, that something unseen was always lurking just out of view. Lyra sat beside him, her eyes scanning the surroundings with an intensity that mirrored his own. She had been quiet for most of the journey, and though Dr. Holt respected her silence, it was clear that the weight of their situation was taking its toll on her. The tension in the air was palpable. It was as if they both knew they were about to enter enemy territory, but couldn't turn back now. They were too close to the finish line. Dr. Holt finally turned to Lyra, his voice firm but gentle. "We need to keep our wits about us. There's no telling who we might encounter here. The syndicates have eyes everywhere. Don't trust anyone." Lyra nodded silently, her jaw tightening slightly in response. The vulnerability she had shown earlier had faded, replaced by the cold, quiet strength she had carried with her since the beginning. It was clear now that Lyra wasn't just running from the past, she was preparing herself for a fight, a battle she wasn't sure she would win, but was determined to face. With a deep breath, Dr. Holt disengaged the ship's systems and stood. The moment his feet hit the metal floor of the station, a shiver ran down his spine. There was a distinct heaviness in the air, a quiet tension that hung in the atmosphere like a storm about to break. The station was old, its once vibrant colors now faded and worn. It had the feel of a place that had seen too many visitors, both friendly and unfriendly, and had survived on the fringes of civilization. There were no grandiose displays of wealth or power here, just the grim utilitarianism of a forgotten outpost, hidden away in a quiet corner of the galaxy. Lyra followed him closely, her footsteps barely making a sound as they walked through the docking bay and into the station's interior. The walls were lined with old machinery, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the cold, rusted floor. It was obvious that this station hadn't seen much traffic in recent years, but that only made it more dangerous. When people wanted to hide, when they wanted to conduct business outside the reach of galactic authorities, places like this were where they went. As they walked deeper into the station, Dr. Holt's senses were on high alert. Every sound, every creak of the metal underfoot, every glance cast in their direction felt amplified. They were being watched. He could feel the eyes on them, the subtle movements of people who were trying to remain unnoticed. They passed through corridors and hallways that stretched into shadowy depths, the occasional figure slipping past them without a word. Some of them glanced at Lyra, but only for a moment, as if they sensed there was something about her that didn't belong. That was when Dr. Holt realized this place, this station, was not as forgotten as it seemed. It was a crossroads for the kind of people who dealt in secrecy and violence, the kind who wouldn't think twice about selling out a stranger for the right price. They came to a small, dimly lit marketplace, a cluster of stalls selling everything from exotic goods to illegal weapons. The smell of stale food and sweat lingered in the air, and the murmur of low conversations filled the space. People huddled in corners, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes darting around nervously as if they were expecting trouble. Dr. Holt and Lyra moved through the crowd, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. But it was impossible not to feel like they were being singled out. Lyra's presence, her alien beauty, was impossible to ignore in a place like this. Her eyes darted nervously as she looked around, her posture tense as she instinctively drew closer to Dr. Holt. "Stay close," he murmured, his hand subtly resting on the sidearm holstered at his waist. He wasn't expecting trouble, but in a place like this, it was always best to be prepared. They made their way toward a small bar at the far end of the market, where a few figures sat hunched over tables, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hoods. The bartender, an older man with a scar running down his cheek, glanced up as they approached. He didn't say a word at first, just studied them with cold, calculating eyes. "What do you want?" the bartender asked, his voice gruff, but not unfriendly. "I'm looking for someone," Dr. Holt replied, his voice calm but firm. "Someone who can help us with a few issues. We need to lay low for a while." The bartender's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Dr. Holt thought he might turn them away. But then something shifted in the man's gaze, a flicker of recognition or understanding, and he nodded toward a shadowy corner of the bar. "Talk to him," the bartender said shortly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But be careful. He's got his own people." Dr. Holt and Lyra exchanged a glance, but without a word, they made their way to the corner. Sitting at the table was a man, his face hidden behind a dark cloak. He was lean, with sharp features, his hands folded in front of him, his posture relaxed but calculating. As they approached, he looked up, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Dr. Holt," the man said, his voice low and knowing, as if he had been expecting him. "I've been waiting for you." Chapter 4, The Dangerous Game. The man sitting at the table leaned forward slightly, his eyes piercing through the shadows as he studied Dr. Holt and Lyra. There was something unsettling about him, something cold and predatory. The way he spoke, the way he moved, it was clear he was no stranger to the dangerous undercurrents of the galaxy. His cloak shifted slightly, revealing a weapon at his side, but it wasn't the weapon that caught Dr. Holt's attention. It was the knowing look in his eyes, the way he seemed to already know everything there was to know about them. "You've been running, haven't you?" the man said with a slight smirk. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. "From the syndicates, from your past. I can see it in your eyes." Dr. Holt's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, but he kept his voice steady. "Who are you?" he asked, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "I'm someone who can help you," the man replied smoothly. "If you're willing to play the game." Dr. Holt's mind raced, trying to process the situation. The man had to be well-connected, someone who dealt with the underworld in ways Dr. Holt couldn't even begin to imagine. And now, here they were, sitting across from him, in the belly of the beast, surrounded by people who had no qualms about turning on them at the first sign of weakness. "Help us," Dr. Holt repeated, his voice steady but laced with skepticism. "What's your angle? Why should we trust you?" The man's smirk widened, and he leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the tension in the air. "Because I know what you're carrying," he said. "I know who you are, and I know what the syndicate wants." Lyra's eyes widened at his words, and she stiffened beside Dr. Holt. Her hand subtly brushed the side of his arm, a silent request for reassurance. Dr. Holt didn't know what to make of this man, but he knew one thing for certain. They were in over their heads, and the game was about to get much more dangerous. "What do you want from us?" Dr. Holt asked, his voice unwavering. The man leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "I want what you have, what you're running from. But more than that, I want to help you survive. The syndicate is on your tail. They won't stop until they get what they want. And I can help you keep it if you're willing to play along." Dr. Holt exchanged a glance with Lyra. They were caught between a rock and a hard place. The syndicate was closing in, and now they were facing someone who knew too much, someone who could be both an ally and a threat. Lyra's voice broke the silence, her words filled with a quiet but undeniable force. "What's your price?" she asked. The man smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down Dr. Holt's spine. "The price is simple. Your trust. And your cooperation." Dr. Holt knew then that they had entered a dangerous game, a game where the stakes were far higher than either of them had imagined. The syndicate was closing in, but so were the shadows of their past, and there was no telling where this path would lead. The room seemed to shrink as the man's cold smile widened, his words hanging heavily in the air. "Trust," he repeated, his voice smooth as velvet, yet his eyes gleamed with something much darker. "Trust and cooperation. That's all it takes for us to get along, don't you think?" Dr. Holt could feel Lyra's body tense beside him, the faint tremor in her hand betraying her anxiety. He didn't trust this man. Everything about him screamed danger, his calm demeanor, his confidence, his knowledge of their situation. But at the same time, Dr. Holt couldn't ignore the fact that they were on the edge of a precipice. They were running out of options, and if this man could provide them with even the slightest hope of survival, he couldn't afford to turn his back on it. The alternative was almost certainly death at the hands of the syndicate, or worse. "I'm not in the habit of trusting people who know too much," Dr. Holt said, keeping his voice steady, even though his pulse raced in his veins. "But we don't have time to play games. So what do you really want?" The man's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He leaned back, clearly enjoying the tension between them. "I'm offering you something far more valuable than money or weapons. I'm offering you protection. The syndicate will stop at nothing to get their hands on her," he said, nodding toward Lyra. "I can help you keep her safe, for a price." Lyra's eyes narrowed at the mention of her. "What do you mean, protection?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Simple," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I can hide you. I can give you a place where the syndicate won't find you. But it comes with a price. A small one. You see, I have a few connections. And some of those connections require certain services. Nothing too difficult. You help me, and I help you." Dr. Holt's mind was spinning. The deal seemed too good to be true, but he couldn't afford to dismiss it outright. They were already on the run, and no matter how much they tried to outrun their past, they couldn't hide forever. The syndicate's reach was vast, and they weren't just after Lyra for her technology, they were after everything she represented. If she could really manipulate energy, if she carried the key to a power beyond their understanding, then Dr. Holt had no doubt that they would stop at nothing to use her, to control her. "You said something about services," Dr. Holt pressed, his suspicion growing. "What exactly do you want from us?" The man leaned closer, his voice lowering even further, almost a whisper. "Let's just say I've been dealing with some unsavory individuals. I need you to handle a few things for me, minor things, really. Some deliveries. A few messages. You won't even have to get your hands dirty. Dr. Holt's gut tightened. He could already see where this was going. He had a feeling this man was in deeper than he was letting on. But in this world, in this galaxy full of secrets and hidden agendas, there was no such thing as an easy deal. I don't trust you, Dr. Holt said bluntly, his eyes locked on the man's. But I don't have much of a choice, do I? The man's smile returned, this time colder than before. You never did. Before Dr. Holt could respond, the station shook. The walls rumbled, a harsh, jarring vibration that sent them all stumbling. Lyra gasped, clutching the edge of the table for support. Dr. Holt's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately sprang to his feet, grabbing Lyra's arm. Get to the ship. Now, he shouted, his voice urgent. The man, for the first time, looked startled. What's going on? He demanded, standing as well. They've found us, Dr. Holt growled, his mind racing. The syndicate's here. Lyra's face turned pale, and for a moment, her eyes betrayed fear, but it was quickly replaced with a cold determination. She nodded sharply, following Dr. Holt as he rushed toward the exit. The sound of heavy footsteps boots rushed through the hallway, echoing against the metal walls. The man's face twisted in frustration, but Dr. Holt had no time for answers. They ran down the station's narrow, dimly lit corridors, hearing the unmistakable sound of doors sliding open and voices calling out in the distance. The syndicate was closing in. It wasn't just the danger of their unknown enemies that filled Dr. Holt with dread. It was the realization that, despite everything, they were not in control. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and as much as he had tried to fight it, he was caught in its web. As they neared the docking bay, the tension in the air reached a boiling point. The station was filled with the stench of impending conflict, and Dr. Holt could hear the distinct sound of weapons being drawn, of soldiers moving into position. They were too close. They wouldn't make it to the ship in time unless. Dr. Holt turned sharply to Lyra, his voice low but filled with urgency. Can you dash? I can, she interrupted, her voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. She raised her hand slightly, closing her eyes in concentration. The air around them seemed to shimmer, and for a split second, everything went still. And then, the hallway erupted in a flash of light. The force was like a shockwave. The sound of cracking metal and screeching walls filled Dr. Holt's ears, and he felt the heat of the blast hit his skin. For a moment, everything was a blur, the world spinning, the sound of the blast ringing in his ears. When the dust settled, he found himself on the floor, his body aching from the impact. His heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through him as he pushed himself up. Lyra was standing beside him, her hands still raised, her breathing shallow but steady. Her eyes were filled with a strange intensity. Her powers had just manifested in a way Dr. Holt had never seen before. They'll be here soon, she said, her voice almost distant. We don't have much time. Dr. Holt nodded, his own survival instincts kicking in. Let's move. They stumbled into the docking bay, where the Galleon starship sat waiting, but the moment they approached the ship's hatch, they were confronted by several armed syndicate agents. The man who had offered them a deal was nowhere to be seen. Get on the ship now, Dr. Holt shouted, pulling Lyra with him as they rushed toward the airlock. The syndicate agents drew their weapons, but before they could react, Lyra raised her hand again. The air seemed to crackle around her, and the agents were thrown back by an invisible force, their weapons clattering to the floor as they slammed against the walls. I told you, Dr. Holt, Lyra whispered, her voice shaking with exhaustion. I'm more dangerous than I seem. Dr. Holt glanced at her, a mixture of awe and fear in his gaze. I'm starting to believe you. They rushed into the ship, locking the hatch behind them. The engines roared to life, and as the Galleon starship ascended, leaving the station and the syndicate agents far behind, Dr. Holt allowed himself a fleeting moment of relief. But that relief was short-lived. As they passed through the station's atmosphere and entered open space, Dr. Holt glanced at Lyra. She was staring out the viewport, her expression distant, almost sorrowful. Where do we go now? He asked, his voice quiet. Lyra's eyes flickered toward him. We keep running, she said simply, and I'll find a way to stop them. But the price is steep. Dr. Holt nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with danger, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a purpose. He wasn't just running away from something. He was running toward something, toward the future, toward a galaxy on the edge of change. And with Lero by his side, perhaps there was hope yet.